Hello and welcome to a new episode of Bite-Sized Book History. I'm your host, Allie Alvis, who you may know better as Book Historia. I'm a book historian and rare book cataloger at antiquarian book dealer Type Punch Matrix. Don't you just love the crinkle of turning a page in your favorite book? This codicological crinkle has been heard numerous times over the centuries, and it's all thanks to paper. The origin of the word paper goes all the way back to the ancient Greek papyros, for pith of the papyrus plant. Interestingly, even though we may think of the rolls and scrolls of ancient Egypt as being made of paper, technically they're not. Paper is defined specifically as utilizing broken down fibers, but papyrus is simply layered strips of pith. In the early centuries of the Western book, pages were not made of fibrous paper, but of skin. This thin skin is called parchment or vellum, depending on the source, and was most often made of the hides of sheep or cows. Parchment and vellum were well suited to the codex format, a codex being basically a bunch of folded sheets sandwiched between two boards. What the books on your bookshelf are. Papyrus is brittle and doesn't stand up well to folding. So with the fall of the scroll and the rise of the codex, strong and flexible parchment and vellum became the preferred page material throughout Europe. Centuries before paper graced the pages of Western books, the Chinese pioneered and refined the art of papermaking. It is said that Cai Lun, a 1st century court official, invented paper as we know it. But as with many historical inventions, it is likely that that story has been embellished somewhat. Cai Lun did, however, push papermaking technology forward significantly. He experimented with different kinds of fibers, including those of the mulberry tree, to make a pulp that would be mixed in water, pressed, and dried. Cai Lun's paper was well loved by Empress Deng Sui, and thanks to her early encouragement and promotion, paper gained a solid foothold in China as a quality writing material. Marco Polo encountered paper on his visit to China in 1275, expressing amazement that, quote, "The emperor has mastered the art of alchemy. He has money made for him out of the bark of trees, to be precise, from mulberry trees." By the time Marco Polo was writing about the wonders of paper money, paper mills had already been established in Europe, in Al-Andalus, the Islamic states that were once located on the Iberian Peninsula. Legend has it that Chinese prisoners imparted their papermaking knowledge to the Arabic world around 751 AD. But the archaeological record shows paper being used in Central Asia as early as the 4th century. While Chinese papermakers had experimented with using beaten linen rags as a base for their paper, Arabic papermakers expanded and improved on this material. For many years, Christian Europeans viewed Al-Andalusian paper as inferior to parchment and dirty, owing to its composition of recycled linen rags. But the relatively cheap production cost of paper was hard to ignore. By the late 14th century, paper mills had been established in Italy, France, and Germany. The process of transforming used rags into paper was quite involved. The rags had to be cut up, soaked in lime and water, and beaten in order to separate the cloth into fibers. These fibers were then mixed with clean water to become the liquidy pulp that, when dried, makes paper. Before papermaking became industrialized in the mid-19th century, Europeans used large mesh molds made of wire to create single sheets of paper at a time. Many of the identifiable aspects of paper are based around this wire mesh mold, which strongly resembles a screen door. If you hold a piece of handmade paper up to the light, you can see the crisscross impression of the wire mesh. And depending on how the sheet is oriented, you may also see a watermark. Watermarks are arrangements of wires on top of the mesh to create designs. The wire caused the paper to be slightly thinner around them. Watermarks were used both as branding for paper mills and as indications of the size of unfolded paper. The wire mesh is surrounded by a wooden frame called a decal, which enables the papermaker to manipulate the mold in the vat of paper slurry without having to touch the mesh. When a sheet of paper emerges from the vat, it has a rough, wavy edge. This is called a decal edge, after the wooden frame. In the hand press period, these edges usually wouldn't be cut off until the paper was printed on, folded, and bound. So sometimes, in books that are still in their wrappers, you can see this decal edge. So how do you get from a screen door-sized piece of paper to a book you can hold in your hands? The answer is a lot of folding. Depending on the intended format of the book, printers printed multiple pages on the same sheet of paper. You may have heard of the terms folio or quarto. Both of these terms refer to the number of times that a single sheet of paper would be folded. A folio is folded once, making 2 leaves and 4 pages, while a quarto is folded twice, making twice that number of leaves and pages. You can see this silly little mock-up here. This pattern continues through octavo, which makes 8 leaves, duodecimo, which makes 12, and all the way up through a series of complicated folds and cuts that results in 125 miniature leaves. These folded sheets, or gatherings, would then be stacked up and sewn together by the binder. In the hand press period, a book buyer usually purchased just a stack of printed gatherings, and it would be up to them to take the book to the binder to have it bound later. Some buyers never got around to binding their books, so that means that we have great examples of how paper was folded. The wood pulp-based paper that most of us are familiar with wouldn't come onto the scene until the 19th century. The raw material of rags was not an infinite resource after all, so intrepid inventors set out to try to make paper out of some different and unique substances. One such individual was Jacob Christian Schaffer, an 18th century German pastor, entomologist, and professor. Schaffer, inspired by fellow entomologist René Antoine Ferchaud de Réaumur's work on the paper wasps of North America, published a 6-volume work on experimental paper materials. The work was so long because Schaffer included samples of his experiments. His papers were made from all sorts of things, including hemp, straw, moss, cabbage stalks, thistles, potatoes, and, coming full circle, even ground-up wasps' nests. The expansive forests of North America turned out to be the next great source of paper material: wood. But wood pulp has a fatal problem, which you may be familiar with if you've ever handled books dating from the early 20th century. The lignin content in wood makes the paper naturally acidic, so it naturally gets kind of crumbly and very yellow over time. When paper is concerned, they really don't make it like they used to. That does it for this episode of Bite-Sized Book History. Drop a comment below if you enjoyed the video or if you have any ideas for topics you would like to hear me speak on in the future. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and check out the description below for links to additional resources about paper, as well as links to my Etsy and my Patreon. I'll see you next time, and remember, don't bite your books.